On January the 11th, 2022, Nicaraguan President Daniel Ortega was sworn into office for his fourth consecutive term, following an electoral process that the United States dismissed as a sham, with much of the Western mainstream media agreeing with them.
And he's making sure he doesn't lose this race by detaining 7 of his opponents, also running for president, and jailing countless dissidents.
President Daniel Ortega is seeking a 4th consecutive term and silencing the opposition before the first vote is cast.
I went to Nicaragua for the presidential elections to find out if what was being reported was true. Did President Daniel Ortega really eliminate his competition by jailing his presidential challengers? Was the New York Times right? Were voting stations closed en masse?
And then all you have to do is look at these so-called correspondents reporting on Nicaragua. Almost none of them are actually in Nicaragua.
Her family originally came from Mozambique. And what about the voices of the indigenous and African communities in Nicaragua? Are they being heard? And are their needs being met?
They really don't know what is really happening in the communities. We want you to tell them.
I travelled throughout Nicaragua to try find some answers.
Today she's seen a journalist.
Only today?
Only today she have a journalist here looking at them and looking how they live and talking with them.
To find out if the once popular Sandinista movement still enjoyed the same mass support that it did in the late 70s and early 80s. And what had the Sandinista government achieved since returning to power in 2007? Nicaragua dominated Western mainstream news agenda during the late 1970s and throughout the 80s, as the United States backed, armed and funded right-wing militia rebel groups known as the Contras to overthrow the Sandinista National Liberation Front, a guerrilla army who came to power in 1979. These events would lead to charges at the International Court of Justice against the US for violations of international law due to their support for the Contras. The Central Intelligence Agency allegedly funded the Contras through cocaine trafficking operations, but my African stream colleague Salifu Mack will break this all down for you.
Get up, put your hands on the hood.
The crack epidemic had a devastating impact on the black community in the United States during the 1980s and early 1990s. It involved the surge in use and distribution of crack cocaine, a cheaper and more potent form of the Class A drug. For many African people in the US, community and family life has never rebounded from the complete and total destruction caused by this dangerous drug. I'm Salifu, and today African Stream is taking a look at what created this surge. Because crack doesn't make itself, and cocaine doesn't just grow on trees in the United States. So how was this drug able to take over our communities?
This is the most addicting thing that probably ever existed in the world.
The answer to this question can be found right at the intersection of anti-communism and racism. So let's take a quick journey, a little field trip. Enter Central America, right below Mexico. Up until the late 1970s, most countries in Central America were controlled by corrupt and violent pro-US puppet dictatorships. This is especially true in the case of a country called Nicaragua. But in 1979, the whole script got flipped. What happened was a group of scrappy leftists and Marxists in Nicaragua overthrew the whole thing and took control, with the support of the people. This created a huge issue for the US. See, if you don't know anything about the United States of America, you need to know that the US loves itself some good old-fashioned capitalism. And in order to maintain the lie that capitalism is the only economic system that can ever work, the US devotes itself to stamping out any attempt to build an alternative, like socialism, everywhere around the world. So this group of revolutionaries in Nicaragua who had just come to power were proposing the redistribution of land while nationalizing banks and providing free healthcare and education. So yeah, in the US's eyes, they had to go. Then President Ronald Reagan, who many of us know as the devil himself, started throwing his full weight behind discrediting and destroying the Sandinistas. Part of his strategy was working with bands of guerrillas in Nicaragua and funding them to help them take on the Sandinistas. This group was known as the Contras, and boy, did Reagan love them. But not everyone loved the Contras the way he did. The US Congress, for example, was not down with the idea of sending billions of dollars to Central America to support civil wars. A chairman of the House Intelligence Committee offered an amendment, quote, prohibiting the use of funds for the purpose of overthrowing the government of Nicaragua, which became law on December 21st, 1982. This put Reagan in a pretty tough position. He had already made all these promises and commitments to his Contra boys down in Nicaragua, and now he had the whole country telling him, nah. So he had to come up with something quick. This is about to get crazy, but stay with me. On the other side of the world, Reagan and the CIA formed a partnership with an Iranian businessman. The deal was the US would sell arms to him in Iran, and in exchange, that money would be used to fund the Contras. But here's the thing about anti-communists. You can usually depend on them to be pretty shady people. And anybody that's willing to fund anti-communist bloodshed in another country is definitely willing to turn a blind eye to messed up stuff going on in their own. So, in Nicaragua, as the missiles were unloaded from the planes, they were being replaced with duffel bags and boxes. And what was inside those duffel bags and boxes, you ask? Cocaine, the purest. When those bags and boxes found their way back to the US, they conveniently found a home in the hood, where it created an entire underground economy involving hood famous figures like Freeway Ricky Ross. For years, the details of this drug trafficking affair were difficult to pin down. Thanks to journalist Gary Webb, author of the Dark Alliance article series, today we better understand just how involved US agencies like the CIA and the Office of the Presidency actually were. According to Webb's research, the US government was allowing the sale of cocaine in inner city, predominantly black neighborhoods to fund the fight against communism abroad. Back in the black community, a community that continued to suffer the ravages of enslavement, segregation, and struggled the hardest under the weight of US capitalism, this economy built on cocaine birthed opportunities for some and took life from many. With cocaine came a wave of addiction and health issues, the disintegration of families, and violent turf wars in our neighborhoods. For decades after the Contra War in Nicaragua, a new war would continue to be fought on the streets of the United States. The victims, African people. This war, the war on drugs, led to the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, an act that was nowhere near as innocent as it sounds. Through racist pseudoscience, US media and policymakers created a boogeyman-like distinction between crack and cocaine. Cocaine was just the powdery stuff that white folks used to have a good time. Crack, though, became known as the notorious rock that turned men into beasts. And in the popular imagination, those beasts were somehow always black. The war on drugs could really just be called the war on Africans. It increased funding for drug law enforcement efforts, leading to more aggressive policing in our communities, and focused on targeting drug users and low-level dealers, not the guys loading cocaine onto planes or the officials pretending they didn't see it. Black men and women alike became victims of this war. African mothers were routinely blamed for the problems of capitalism and poverty, and were ruthlessly criminalized, regardless of whether they used drugs or not. I gotta pause here for a second to emphasize how many people were impacted by this. Through the 1-2 punch of the war on drugs, followed by the 1994 crime bill, which was authored by current US President Joe Biden, Between 1975 and 2019, the US prison population jumped from 240,000 to 1.43 million Americans. Today, Africans make up 13% of the US population, but account for more than 38% of the general prison population. And what of Nicaragua? Well, to this day, the US has never abandoned its relentless pursuit to regain control of Central America. In fact, while the US continues to deny basic human rights to its African populations, through the ongoing successes of the Sandinista revolution, Africans and indigenous people in Nicaragua today enjoy the creation of their own autonomous zone on the Caribbean coast of the country, with the full support of the people's government. It's a bit of hope tied by string to a history marred by death and destruction.
Thank you, Salafu, for the excellent breakdown. Now back to the story. The Sandinistas were voted out of power in 1990, following the long, bloody US-backed proxy war and suffocating US-imposed economic blockade, with many Western-based news agencies losing interest in the Central American country soon after. However, that began to change on April 18, 2018, in what many believe to be another US-sponsored attempt to overthrow the Sandinista government that had returned to power in 2007.
I remember that on April 18th, they started to march against the problem with Social Security, a law that 3 days later was abolished. It was rolled back, but they were determined to go further.
The demonstrations that occurred in several major cities were initially against the Social Security reforms, but would soon morph into something else, leading to a chain of events that would lead to hundreds of Nicaraguans being killed and mass civil unrest. Nicaragua, until that point, according to the United Nations Human Development Agency, was designated the second safest country in Latin America. John Perry is a British Nicaraguan dual citizen who has been visiting Nicaragua since 1984 and moved to Masaya in Nicaragua in 2003 with his Nicaraguan wife.
What basically happened was that the roadblocks were a kind of way of controlling the whole population. So people couldn't go to the markets without passing the roadblocks. They'd be asked for money. They'd have their bags searched. If it was found that they were Sandinista supporters, or even worse, say an off-duty police officer, they may well have been taken away and interrogated or beaten up or tortured, or in one or two cases even killed.
John was so frustrated with the coverage he saw in the British press that he wrote a letter to The Guardian to protest their reporting and to give an account that was simply not being heard. The Guardian, to their credit, published his letter, but as far as he's concerned, that doesn't absolve them for the amount of disinformation they and other Western media outlets put out.
They were bringing in gang members from Honduras and El Salvador. They were paying them substantial amounts, not just in money, but they were paying them with liquor and marijuana every night. So people would arrive with boxes of money, boxes of small bottles of very crude liquor. It's not difficult to imagine that the state of the city, with no police in the streets and everybody leaving the streets at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon because it was so unsafe, was really terrible. None of this was portrayed in the international media. The picture that was painted in the international media was that the streets were being controlled by people who needed to keep out the police who were trying to attack ordinary people. And this was far from the case. The police were confined to their barracks, to the central police station, and they were under fire through all of this period. Several police officers were killed or injured by bombs thrown into the police station and this kind of thing.
John was treated differently to his Nicaraguan wife because he looked like a foreigner.
They were, all the terrorists were in charge of the roads, and we couldn't do anything. We had to walk with our head down. I remember twice I saw a guy cover her head and walking with a hand like that, and 4 or 5 people behind him. And the person who was walking with me said, "Don't look, just put your head down." And I said to him, I want to see who is the person so we can tell the families. And he said, don't, because they can catch you and take you, and they might rape you or do something to you. So we couldn't do anything at all. And I remember also once I tried to go by the back to a place called Mazatepe to look for some food. I tried to go through roads and that I knew I could move, but on the way back, when I was coming back about 2 kilometers away from the house, they already blocked the road. And I tried with my mother and the other 2 women who were with me to take the branch away, because it was a big tree who they cut, and I tried to go past, and out of the blue I saw like 25 guys with guns, and they were manipulating them, and some of them were like pointing at us, and it was just horrifying. I thought I was going to die in there with my mom.
According to John, the international media and commentators in the US and the UK were simply regurgitating the testimonies of local Nicaraguan right-wing media outlets like El Turcolo 66, who were part of the coup attempt and orchestrated a narrative that placed the blame for the violent attacks solely on young Sandinistas and the police force. Yet, the people I spoke to painted a very different picture. Reinaldo Jose Ubena was one of the individuals that was brutally attacked by the opposition mob that tried to make it seem like it was the work of Sandinista youth. At the time, he was guarding Messiah's municipal depot when it was attacked and ransacked by the mob.
Empiezan a saquearlo y recuerdo que posteriormente un grupo bien armado y me agarraron.
They started the looting, and I remember that afterwards a heavily armed group came in and they got hold of me. They took me to a hall, and there they started to torture me. Why did they torture me? They wanted to know where the mayor was. We already had moved the mayor somewhere else because their intentions were to kill him and then upload the videos to a Facebook page named Messiah Information, which was a digital platform that was very active in spreading fake news. Since I didn't tell them anything, they started to torture me. With the butts of their AK-47s and shotguns, they hit me here in the armpit. At some point, my bicep, of so much torture and blows, snapped, and a blood spurt came out. They left me laying there for maybe 8 minutes. Maybe they thought they had killed me. Later, I managed to get on my feet, and the criminals themselves took me to an improvised clinic they had there, where they took pictures of me. The criminals claimed that they had saved me from the Sandinista youth. That was their way of misinforming. If a public institution was burnt down, they said it was the Sandinista youth. When they burnt down the handicraft market, it was the Sandinista youth. It wasn't that. It was the same criminals who wanted to blame the government. So they took me to that clinic they had. I remember they put on a lot of bandages here, but there was no way of stopping the bleeding. We were targets because we worked for the government. If we went to the hospital, at any of the barricades we had to go through, and there were over 60 in total, at any of those barricades we could die. So it was a very hard decision waiting until the streets were cleaned up criminals. And so we did. We spent 6 days waiting for the streets to get cleaned up so many criminal elements. And when I got to the hospital, my arm already was severely infected. The muscle tissue was dead and the arm had a foul smell. And they had to cut me up because of the torture.
As far as Reinaldo was concerned, he was one of the lucky ones. Nicaraguan police officer Gabriel Vardo Ruiz had an even more tragic fate after he was kidnapped, tortured and dragged from behind a car, and then his body was set on fire, all captured on video and again distributed on social media. In one of the most infamous scenes of the 2018 coup attempt was when Catholic nuns were seen praying by his body. Reinaldo believes the Catholic Church were not innocent bystanders in the coup attempt, but actually an instrumental player pulling the strings.
Por ejemplo, acá en Masaya, el 19 de abril.
Step by step, we started to realize that what was taking place in Nicaragua actually was a coup. For example, here in Masaya on April 19th. On April 19th appeared gangs of young criminals, young people. We call them youths at risk, most of them from Manimbo. So they took to the streets. I remember that a priest from the Salesian Church, a Catholic order, went out to give them his blessings. And after that, the first looting started to take place in Masaya. They started by looting a motorbike store named Masia. They took out all the motorbikes and stole them. Then they continued with another store named Trapigas. They did the same thing. They looted all the stores along the main street. As days went by, the criminals started to get more organized because they started to receive funding, because they were getting money, they were getting booze, they were getting drugs. So they were feeling great. That priest, Harvey Padilla, spread an audio telling the criminals that they should be careful with the photos and the video of that officer they were burning up so they wouldn't have problems with the international media, and told them to delete all that stuff. He said that if a police officer was captured, he should be dumped in an outhouse, that is a pit latrine instead. Imagine a priest, a leader of faith, giving such instructions. The next day, when Edwin Roman arrives with Alvaro Leyva, their idea is to hide the corpse. But there was no corpse left anymore, because since it had been burning with all the tires, all his skin was molten onto the roadway. It was like when you burn plastic. Such an ugly sight.
The violent protests in 2018 would eventually lead to economic sanctions imposed on the country, and once again Nicaragua's Sandinista government to be in the crosshairs of Western powers and media outlets, with them all joining in unison to dismiss the 2021 presidential elections as illegitimate before they even took place. I met up with Nicaraguan-based American independent journalist Ben Norton from investigative news website Multipolarista to find out more about how the events in 2018 linked to the international scrutiny of the 2021 presidential elections.
You can't understand what's going on in modern Nicaraguan politics without understanding the 2018 coup attempt. In 2018, with millions of dollars in funding from the United States, from European Union member states, from foreign governments, right-wing extremists tried to violently overthrow the elected Sandinista government. They erected violent barricades called tranques, which are modeled after the violent barricades in Venezuela called guarimbas. They erected them across the country. They demobilized the country. They prevented people from going to their jobs, people from going to school. They paralyzed the country for nearly 3 months with these violent tranque barricades. And then right-wing extremists with foreign funding, they hunted down Sandinistas, they killed Sandinistas, they tortured Sandinistas, they published lists on WhatsApp of Sandinistas' home addresses and phone numbers, along with photos. The strategy is the same strategy used by the insurgents in Hong Kong and other countries. If the government responds to the violence, then that footage is taken out of context and spread around the world, and the government is portrayed as an authoritarian regime, as a police state, even though the violence was initiated by these far-right insurgents. The people who led that coup attempt faced legal consequences, and because they faced legal consequences, because they were detained and there's a judicial process against them, their foreign sponsors in Washington and Brussels redefined them as presidential hopefuls and as political prisoners. This is a matter of public record. We have the documents showing millions of dollars going to these coup leaders from CIA cutouts like the National Endowment for Democracy, like the U.S. Agency for International Development. Now, the U.S. claims USAID as a so-called humanitarian organization, but here in Nicaragua, Nicaraguans are very familiar with what USAID actually is.
One of the most well-known victims of the 2018 violence was a man called Bismarck Martinez, a Sandinista activist who disappeared on June 29, 2018 after being kidnapped, tortured and killed by a violent right-wing gang who filmed the maltreatment and circulated it on social media.
In 2018 there were protests and he was traveling to join us, the rest of the family, in the city of Hinatope. for the simple reason of having travelled to meet his family, and for having been identified as a government worker, they kidnapped, tortured, murdered and disappeared him.
According to the testimony by Leonardo Mendoza, an ex-member of one of the right-wing mobs, the gangs used an app called Zilo, which worked as a walkie-talkie radio to keep them informed on what the gang's leadership was doing. On Friday 29th around 8:30 p.m, Mendoza heard João Maldonado, a notorious leader of one of the opposition gangs, using the app to communicate to other members that they had abducted an old man and were about to torture him. But according to the Daily Mail, João Maldonado, the gang leader who allegedly abducted and tortured Bismarck Martinez, was just a political activist, being described as activists or presidential candidates. In fact, leading up to the 2021 presidential elections, Deutsche Welle, the German state-owned international broadcaster, was claiming that all those who had a chance of beating incumbent Nicaraguan President Daniel Ortega had been detained and prevented from standing. And they were just a small part of the chorus of similar headlines coming from Western media publications.
None of them had been selected as presidential candidates, and most of them decided they were presidential candidates themselves very shortly before they were arrested. It's true that one or two of them might have been chosen as presidential candidates for opposition parties, but had they been chosen and had they run in the election, two things would have happened. One is that very likely several opposition parties would have run, at least two or perhaps three, in addition to those that ran anyway, which would have meant their vote would have been divided. And it was this division within the opposition was there right up to the time when these arrests happened. So it was very likely that there would be more than one so-called opposition candidate anyway. And as it happened, even if the turnout at the election had been the highest ever, which is approaching 80%, and even if all of the non-Sandinista votes had gone to somebody like Juan Sebastián Chamorro, who was perhaps the leading opposition figure who was arrested, he wouldn't have won. He would have needed nearly 500,000 Sandinista voters to change sides in order to back him. So the idea that Daniel Ortega won on false pretenses is absurd. I mean, there are over 2 million Sandinista card-carrying members in Nicaragua for a start, and there are only 4.5 million voters.
On June 8, 2019, the Nicaraguan National Assembly approved an amnesty law that pardoned and released all participants and organisers of the violent protests and clashes that began in April 2018, but the amnesty was conditional.
That in June 2019 the government decided to allow these prisoners out on a conditional amnesty, that they stop engaging with the organisations that were causing the violence. And those that did get released and did stop their activities are still going around normally in the streets of Nicaragua.
En el núcleo familiar nos sentimos bastante, es un dolor, ¿verdad? Increíble.
There are laws that gave people who caused so much destruction, people who committed murder, a second chance. That is why an amnesty law was passed in Nicaragua. That law benefits them actually. All their deeds were forgiven for the sake of peace in Nicaragua.
The Nicaraguan National Assembly in 2020 was able to pass the Foreign Agents Law, which meant they were able to starve the destabilizing opposition groups of their funding.
Nicaragua's Foreign Agents Law is very similar to the FARA, that is the Foreign Agents Registration Act in the United States, which has existed for over 80 years. This is World War II era legislation, but Nicaragua dared to pass similar legislation, saying, it's very controversial, that if you take millions of dollars from a foreign government, you have to register as a foreign agent.
One of the most well-known candidates to be arrested and then disqualified from running was Cristina Chamorro, from one of Nicaragua's wealthiest families and the most powerful oligarch family in Nicaragua. The family dynasty has provided Nicaragua with 6 presidents in the last 150 years and have spent more time in power than the Somoza dictatorship that the Sandinistas overthrew in 1979. Moreover, they control some of the biggest media outlets in Nicaragua that were seen as key players in the 2018 attempt to overthrow the government, such as La Prensa, a Nicaraguan newspaper which was also suspected of supporting the CIA-backed Contras in their war against the Sandinistas in the 1980s. Cristina was the director of the Chamorro Foundation, which was found to be the recipient of millions of dollars of USAID before it shut down its operations in Nicaragua after the passage of the Foreign Agents Law.
We have documents from the NED showing millions of dollars going to Nicaraguan coup leaders, these right-wing extremists. Their names are on the documents. We also know that another CIA cutout, the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, was sending that money to these so-called NGOs in Nicaragua, but they're not actually NGOs. What they are fronts of the opposition. Now, if you are a right-wing opposition leader, if you want to try to destabilize the Sandinista government, and you want to get funding from a foreign government to finance your activities, your political activities, all you do is you get two of your friends together and you form a so-called NGO. Now, you don't need to do anything. Maybe you publish one report a year. What it actually functions as is a pass-through. It's a way for the US government, the Spanish government, the British government to send millions of dollars to you to fund your political activities by using a fake NGO as a front.
A coalition of opposition parties in Nicaragua called on voters to boycott November's presidential poll, and the US imposed fresh sanctions just 4 days before the crucial vote. However, that call was largely ignored, with a turnout of 65.2%, which was roughly the same percentage as the US presidential elections in 2020, which incidentally set the record in the United States for the highest voter turnout in 120 years. I was able to travel to Nicaraguan city of Chinandega to observe the electoral process.
So I'm here in Chinandega in Nicaragua. It's November the 7th and it's election day. And as you can see behind me, it's bustling with enthusiasm. Now the mainstream media claims that these are sham elections, but if it was truly sham elections, there wouldn't be people out here who are clearly believing in the process and clearly believe that their vote counts.
It's a citizen's duty to participate in the vote. That's why I came early, to avoid the long line. Since it's back there, it's already filling up.
Daniel Ortega's Sandinista party got 75.87% in the 2021 presidential elections, an increase of 38.7% of the vote that it got in the 2006 presidential elections. I was interested to understand how they doubled their vote in just 15 years.
Sandinista Front is a popular government, and there's constant propaganda claiming otherwise, but polls consistently show that around 2/3 of Nicaraguans support the Sandinista government, and that shouldn't be a big surprise because the Sandinistas are really the only government that has provided social programs, universal health care and education, good quality infrastructure, and security.
I decided to spend as much time as possible travelling by car and boat to some of the most remote villages in the country to find out about what the government was doing.
Today there is a program named after him, Bismarck Martinez. We're so proud that today so many families in need benefit from it, and he was like that. In the municipality of Managua, he worked for the welfare of those in need, the people that needed roads in their neighborhoods, parks, and that's what he did. And that strengthens us as a family and fills us with joy.
I visited Bismarck Martinez Housing Project with American journalist Dan Kovalek.
This is a development of houses for working poor. They pay about $40 a month for these homes. There are 1,400 of them already constructed, and as you can see, more are being constructed. There's about 30,000 homes like this throughout Nicaragua for the poor. These have been built by the government of Nicaragua, the Sandinista government.
The benefits of this project don't matter if you're Sandinista or not. This project is for all Nicaraguan citizens, irrespective of your politics.
When the Sandinistas returned to power in 2007, 48.3% of Nicaraguans were living in poverty, and almost 17.2% in extreme poverty.
By 2022, after 15 years in power, the Sandinistas, through state-sponsored social programs, had managed to reduce these numbers from 48.3% to 24.9%, and extreme poverty from 17.2% to 6.9%.
Illiteracy rates also fell from 35% to 3%. Nicaragua ranks 5th in terms of gender equality, ahead of many of its detractors, including the United States and the United Kingdom. After regaining power, the Sandinistas implemented a policy of free healthcare for all, began building schools and colleges in rural areas, and provided direct support to poor farmers who today produce most of the wealth in the country.
The cooperatives are very important here in Nicaragua. The small farmers still produce over 50% of the production, probably 60 or 70% of the production. And for trading and for processing, they're organised in cooperatives. And they were given the land during the land reform of the revolution back in the 80s, when the structure they used was cooperatives. So cooperatives are really important here, and they work, and people believe in them.
There are 5,000 farmer cooperatives in Nicaragua, comprising of around 300,000 farmers.
Small farmer cooperative Nicaragua is incredibly resourceful, and basically they continued producing. You can see there's not a roadblock that can stop these guys,
Over 90% of the food consumed in Nicaragua is produced within its national borders. 80% of it is produced by peasant farmers. In November 2020, 2 Category 4 hurricanes hit the same waterside community of Hullover in the space of 2 weeks. I made the trip to the remote community with Nicaraguan-based reporter Stephen Sefton to find out what support was offered to communities most affected by the hurricanes.
Our way to the community of Hullover, which is a community right on the edge of the Caribbean Sea in northern Nicaragua, on the northeastern coast, about an hour and a half south of Billweed by launch. Hullover is a community that was struck by 2 hurricanes in November of 2020. The first hurricane was Hurricane Eta, which was a force 4 hurricane, and then 10 days later Hurricane Iota struck exactly the same area, and that was a force 5 hurricane. And so the effect of that was to cause almost complete destruction of the community.
We're extremely grateful to the government because in effect what they did was save our lives, and what greater deed can you hope for someone to do for you than saving your life?
It was a force 4 hurricane. Iota was a force 5 hurricane, and it just destroyed everything in its path here in Hullover. So the community have been able to not only survive the hurricane, but get support to come back to their community, not just rebuild their houses, rebuild their school, rebuild the clinic, which I hope we'll be able to film later on, but they've also had help with getting their fishing equipment replaced, thanks to government support, to enable them to actually engage in the economic activity that is their traditional activity and get back to some kind of normal life.
Nicaragua today is considered the leader in Central America because of its legal framework that enables a comprehensive approach to disaster risk management, but that wasn't always the case. In 1998, Hurricane Mitch hit and claimed 3,800 lives in Nicaragua alone, largely due to flooding and lack of support from the neoliberal government, who were reluctant to take action. Incidentally, this was regarded as a major catalyst for the Sandinistas returning to power less than 10 years later.
I am a former fighter for Contras and the Yatama, but I gave up on Yatama because I realized they were doing nothing for our community. That's why I made the jump and started supporting the FSLN. The oligarchy in Nicaragua used the Sandinistas to overthrow Somoza, and then subsequently they used the Nicaraguan resistance for their own purposes to overthrow the Sandinistas. It was very clear when the fighting ended that the ruling class in Nicaragua had no interest in people living in impoverished circumstances, people on low income, campesino, and they certainly weren't interested in the indigenous people, and that's why I changed my mind to the Sandinista front, which is the only political force that represents the interest of the people that most need help.
What these foreign governments are saying is completely false. Here is a community where you can see the benefits of all the things the government has supported us with in all kinds of ways. Not just with help with the hurricane and helping us restore economic activities, but in all kinds of other ways, helping us with healthcare and education and so on.
We also visited the indigenous waterside community of Carita.
This is one of the last areas in Nicaragua that has no electricity. I think in 2006, just before the government came into power, the territory of Nicaragua that was covered by electricity was around 54%. Today, it's around 96%. So I'm told that the only other Western reporters to come here are National Geographic, and they came here to report on the nature. There's never been anyone here from the BBC, CNN, MSNBC, The Guardian. None of these entities that talk about Nicaragua in disparaging terms consistently have ever visited these rural waterside communities.
And then finally, the largest mosquito municipality on the Caribbean coast, Westpam.
So I'm on the border of Nicaragua and Honduras. We're just driving past to try to get to the northern river that splits between Nicaragua and Honduras. And we've just come across this celebration of people who are celebrating the victory of Daniel Ortega. Now, as you can see, there's no police here. This is just working class people that have come together on their motorbikes, on their bicycles, in their cars, just to celebrate the victory. These are not paid agents, these are just children.
The locals I spoke to did not speak any Spanish and only spoke Mosquito.
The United States says that Daniel needs to go, that he is no good for Nicaragua. What do you say to that?
Government kababila, Daniel Destu takiway. Mandi aluki sa bawal.
Yang nani Mosquito Ilian Villa, with President Kaballo kikaka. Well, yang nani pas balay kitiki sibara Daniel Sakbiawi. Bako.
Yes, she got very excited with that because she said that is the only president that really have them coming out of the...
Mosquito dantig dia, that time within Sipsa, ikan bara Daniel Sak.
That the mosquitoes love Daniel because with Daniel they see the progress, they see the difference.
Dia lika Daniel Daukras, kultuk tam, motil kaya bisa, sus kaya bisa, pra kaya bisa, pataya bisa, dia lika Daukras Daniel.
What the government doesn't do. The government gives the children their shoes, their clothes, their food, they have the education. They don't see any other government.
And as indigenous women, I can tell them that they can come over, just how you came, to know about our reality. That they mustn't be thinking and just seeing what the different company of communication want them to know about. Those companies work for that system, but we work for our reality.
Thank you so much. Gracias.
Go and tell any president that want to clear, like if they are so, and talk about this. Go and tell them the reality of what happened here.
Thank you.
Our government.
Thank you. Gracias. Thank you.
Everywhere I travelled, the message was clear. Tell the people back home what you've seen. I was told to tell the journalists who write about Nicaragua to make the trip, come and speak to Nicaraguans based in Nicaragua.
I've been in Nicaragua for 2 weeks, and it's by no means long enough to make definitive conclusions about how the country is governed. But it does make me perhaps more qualified than some of the reporters that write article after article, often mirroring the line of the US State Department without ever stepping foot in the country. And certainly without visiting the indigenous communities of Caritá, West Palm, and the largely African community of Hullover. On my many travels throughout this multilingual country, I've spoken to diverse people from various backgrounds that have different wants and needs, but one common determination: not to allow their country's affairs to be dictated to by Washington.
Oh no, don't lie